when people watch our content or when they come to one of our events, which we'll talk about in a little bit, a lot of the times they're like, I've never seen anything like that. In my comment earlier of like, oh, that's just everyday life over in this third world country because of the reliance and relationship they have on God. You have to ask the individual who says they've never seen anything like this, are you putting yourself in a place, in a posture to see it? How humble are you being, or are you being
Available.
are you being available,
Yeah.
or are you being uptight about what it might look like to see a miracle? Because if you see a miracle and then you have to talk about it, now you're the crazy one,
Yeah.
right? So like,
Yeah.
there is this give and take. Like, yes, God does break in miraculous ways for people that aren't asking for it. I always go back to Sodom and Gomorrah when Lot was lingering, and it was like out of compassion, God took him out of there, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't him being obedient, being like, I'm going to leave, but God was like, I'm compassionate enough to break in and change what you're trying to make your reality, which is great. And I think that happens all the time. But on like on a daily basis, having that relationship with God, you'll see miracles over and over and over again. Hi, and welcome to the very first episode of the Go Tell John podcast. I'm Chris, and this is Stephanie, and we run an organization called Acts Ministries. So we've been doing Acts Ministries for a little while now, and it's kind of been an amazing adventure. People who are watching this are going to wonder, like, what is an Acts Ministries? And, like, why is a podcast called Go Tell John? So I think that maybe we should get started by explaining a little bit of what we do and why we do it. And then we can kind of move into the, like, future of this podcast, the future of our ministry, and what that looks like for us coming up over the next year or so.
I feel like our ministry has gone through so many iterations of what we initially heard from God and thought we were doing, and then how God has like fleshed it out over time, right? Yeah. So like when we initially heard from God, it was like, yeah, we're going to do video testimonies, which makes sense since you're a videographer and have been for a while, right? Like, okay, we've done this in the past with nonprofits, but God like calling us deeper. When was that? 2023, right? Yeah. So God's calling us deeper, not to just do this for nonprofits, but to really show his glory.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, okay? Yeah. Because like one of the things that I think could be a misconception when you talk about a ministry and things like that is that you would look at somebody like us and think maybe this was something that we were born and bred into, right? And we see this all the time. We interview missionaries and we interview people that have these amazing stories of redemption. And it's like, oh, you meet them in a point where they already are, where they've been transformed already, and they're like, oh, that's who they've always been. So I definitely want to make clear that, like, at this point, you and I have both lived completely different lives, and being called into being missionaries and having a ministry is not only something that in the grand scheme of things is relatively new, but also an adventure that is, like you said, started one way and is morphing and morphing and morphing, and it all kind of began with a yes to God, right? We, in the very, very beginning, when we were deciding, we had already given God our yes, right? And we were deciding, what is it that yes means? And we'll do discussions on another day of like what that looked like. The ups and downs of trying to fit into, try to figure out God's plan when he's not ready to tell you what it is yet is probably the best way to explain it. Absolutely. But we'll start at this point where we were sitting in prayer. We already had our situations where we thought we were going one direction and God closed doors. And then we thought we were obeying and going a different direction and God shut doors, right? So we got to this point where, as you said, I'm a videographer. It's a skill that I've built over a couple of years. And I really wanted to use that to further the kingdom in certain ways. And you kept coming to me and saying, Chris, I think this is the direction that God wants us to go. I think he wants us to travel around and film things. And I'll say film things because at that point we didn't really know. No. Like now we film testimonies of encounters with God. Like that's the main thing that we do, among other things that we'll get into. But at that point, we're like, we just need to film what God's doing in the world. And I was not bought into it. Like I have, as you know, have dealt with chronic pain ever since I could remember. And our original plan with God was to go somewhere overseas and work with a ministry, be in one place, and just work with people, because that's kind of like where our heart is with God's people. And so when you were like, hey, I think that we should take this on the road, right? We should go film people doing ministry wherever, all over the world, in the States and wherever God calls us to. I was not sold on it. I was like, I said okay to be in an area where I know that like my chronic pain will be the same as it is now where we're at. And the idea of like lugging camera equipment, I mean, geez, our first trip to Africa in January was like 24 hours of flying on each end and multiple planes and
brutal without chronic pain.
Yeah. We had a toddler and a bunch of camera equipment that weighed more than a toddler. So it was definitely something that I hadn't signed up for. Yeah. I think we can get into the groove of things where we said, yep, we have made Jesus Lord. We gave him our yes. We'll do whatever he asks. And he goes, hey, how about this thing? And even though like that thing isn't hard per se for like a normal person, for me, I'm like, that's hard for me. Yeah. And luckily, as we've been doing this, we haven't really ran into any extreme physical problems. So like the Lord's working. He's called us into this and he's walking with us through it. I'm not miraculously healed yet or anything, but it is manageable and it's working. Yeah. So when we didn't know what God wanted us to do, but we gave this, you had this verbal idea of we are going to go around and kind of document what God is doing in his people. That was like our original mission statement, the basics of that. And we sat for 8 months.
Yeah, 8 months.
Yeah, we sat in 8 months in prayer about, okay, God, like we gave you yes, you shut all these doors that we thought you were calling us to. Now what? Yeah. And I remember that in retrospect, at the end of that, I looked at it, that God was showing me. I felt like he was telling me, like, I knew you, but I really need you to know me. And we'll deep dive into that again in another time. There's a lot of stories that we need to tell, but that's not for today. Yeah. So we're 8 months in. Yeah. We're sitting in our prayer room in the morning, reading our Bibles. Yeah. And you, again, after I had said I don't want to do that multiple times, it felt like
it was. Yeah.
You decided to bring up the conversation again. And can you tell me all that detail?
Yeah. So after multiple times of bringing it up, like the Lord was laying on my heart, like you said, 8 months of prayer, like, and it wasn't some audible voice. It wasn't like, I can't even tell you like the confirmation I had, because I don't even know if it was confirmation at that point. Just this on my heart that it was supposed to be video and it was supposed to be with God's people specifically. That's kind of all I knew, right? And so like you said, we were trying to sort this out. Well, that morning I bring it up again and I'm like, I really feel, Chris, like this is what we're supposed to be doing. And you gave that like, if the Lord wills it, we can look into it, sort of a thing, right?
I think I said we could
yes.
look into what that might look like.
Yeah. So, you go off to the other room before we sit down, and I sit down to read my daily devotion, and it's Luke 1. 1 is where the devotion was starting in Luke 1. So in Luke 1, which I've read Luke so many times, And I start reading it and I just start bawling. And that is the moment that I would say is confirmation of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to start crying right now. This is what we're supposed to be doing. Like, God has just said, like, here is your stamp. And I think it was almost at looking back, like getting you to the point of saying yes. You like ready to say yes to the Lord, and then He like really divulging it, right? Like so many missionaries that we talk to, and it's like true in our own lives, right? Through this story of you say yes, and then He gives you the next step. And then you say yes, and He gives you the next step, right? So, like, I read Luke 1 and I'm just bawling, and Chris comes back into the room, and I'm like, you have to listen to this. Did you want to read it?
Yeah. I have this up. This is a New Living Translation, and it says, "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They use the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught."
Yeah. Come on.
I think what the version that you were reading said to accumulate,
Compile a
compile,
narrative.
yeah, compile a narrative.
Yeah, of the things you have seen. And I just read it and I was like, that's what we're doing. We're compiling a narrative of what God is doing throughout the world.
Mhm.
And it was like such a real moment. And like I said, I've read that so many times. It's just the opening of Luke. I'm like, how many people have cried in the opening of Luke? Like, I've never heard a message on the opening of Luke, right? It's just the dedication of the book. But the Lord used it. Like, I mean, when He says it's a living word, it's a living word, right? But yeah, in that moment, I can't remember your exact response. Like, well, I guess that's what we're doing now, or
Yeah,
something.
those were my exact words. It was, well, I guess that's what we're doing now.
And so that's where we started. And honestly, I feel like through that, yes, came a series of God showing us little by little what's next, what's next, what's next, as we kind of fumbled our way through how do we set up a ministry? We've never done this before.
Yeah.
We don't come from missionary backgrounds. Um, I mean, yeah, you did videography work, and I have like, the finance background, the budget background, and we can do the work, but how to set up the whole ministry looked totally different from our initial yes, which was I'll go be an international missionary, to now, okay, God, compiling a narrative of what you're doing around the world. Like, what does that mean? That's so broad. What are we doing? So even though we had confirmation,
Yeah.
we still didn't know.
And yet we were like, we just went, which has its benefits, of not getting stuck in the like how and when and why and like all that stuff. And it also has its challenges, of just kind of going in, I don't know, going in without wisdom, would probably be the best way to explain it.
Yeah, I think sometimes you can get ahead of yourself. Like, you feel like you have to fill in the blank when maybe the Lord's calling you to sit and wait.
Yeah.
Like, and when you are trying to fill in the blank by yourself, I think that's where the lack of wisdom comes in, which we've learned over time. Like, sometimes it's okay to sit and wait for Him to answer the question because He's faithful and He will.
Yeah, and oddly, coming from a place where we both are really passionate about people, and we have this tendency to be the one that fixes everything. Um, and it has been a wisdom learning experience of when to say, maybe that's not right for us right now. Like
Yeah.
maybe that doesn't meet the needs and the requirements of our ministry, what God has called us to. Although maybe it would meet your needs, maybe that's not what God's calling us to right now. And that does involve, it involves wisdom, and it involves prayer,
Yeah.
and it does.
Mentors. It's helped to have mentors to talk through to it that, we're connected to all these different missionaries through our fiscal sponsor, but like having other missionaries to talk to who've been through it, who've been walking with the Lord and walking out the faith and obedience for a while has been huge for us.
Yeah.
So trying to do it on your own, like the Lord will guide you through it, but he doesn't call us to do it alone. So like he will call you into community, and he will call you into people, and he'll bring you the resources you need and the people that you need. So like I think the wisdom that I particularly have learned is like more humility. Like you don't know. And the world's version of what you should do in this situation doesn't really matter. Like take it into account. Maybe there's earthly wisdom that applies, but also the Lord does things in his own way on his own time. And so like just because that's what the world does doesn't mean that's what God is wanting you to do. So yeah, it's been a fascinating what has a year and a half.
Yeah. I think that's a good point to kind of jump into like the formulation of what the ministry has become over the last year.
Yeah.
Because at first, like we were saying, like we thought we were just going to go, like to be honest, it was like we were going to go over to wherever and live with missionaries who are doing work in the field for weeks or even months at a time and just like really capture what they're doing. And then we quickly learned that like there was a different focus that we felt like God wanted us to be on. So I mean, to kind of break it down a little bit, like we have 4 main pillars of like the things that we do, right? One of the things that we do is we help missionaries in ministries. So
deep passion.
Yeah, so like a missionary would have, say, an initiative video. Maybe they need a video of them talking about their ministry, so they could give it to their group or potential donors, things like that, just to get awareness out and to further the kingdom.
Yeah.
There's so many missionaries out there that are doing work in places that I can't even pronounce their names, right? And
people don't know.
Yeah. And the thing about ministry is you have a lot of people that maybe don't have the technical skills, but they have so much passion, and God has called them to be something else. Like they're not calling us all to be on social media. They're not calling us all to know how to work cameras and computers and editing software. Like that's something that takes a lot of time, and it is something that like it's a skill base.
Yeah, and not everybody has the eye for the telling stories. Like we talk about this a lot. We've run into a lot doing these missionary initiative videos or even ministry videos that are focused on kind of who we are, what we do, just to share what they are, is that we say, and it's so true, and I hope it doesn't come across wrong, but that there's a lot of passion and not a lot of know-how, right? So when you're talking about sharing stories, like a lot of people don't know how to share stories, but they can love people like through and through all day long, without ceasing, sort of a thing. Or they can go over to these countries in third world countries or places in the 1040 window that you're not even allowed to be doing this in, and can just pour out. But they don't know how to get the word out about what they're doing. And so then they're stuck in a place that's very vulnerable, very dangerous, and they don't have a community around them because they simply don't know how to share what their needs are, right?
Yeah, and in that same vein of things, like it's weird because it's kind of less offensive to be like, oh, they're really good at doing ministry, but not good at finances, keeping the books, all that technical
people don't
stuff, and they're
bother
like, oh
with
yeah, of course, lots of people aren't good at that, but to sit down and say like, hey, you're doing amazing work, and you just don't know how to express your story.
Yeah.
Right. So in those moments, we do coach people on those kind of things. There's a lot of us like asking probing questions to get, for one, to get people comfortable, because it's uncomfortable to be in front of a camera. It's uncomfortable to be in front of a camera. So like working with them, I usually put you behind the camera asking them questions because you have the face that they will be more comfortable with. Is the best way to say it. And I'm usually behind the cameras doing the stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of coaching to make them feel comfortable, coaching to, as they're talking about their ministry, to draw that passion out of them. So that's one of the things we do. And on a larger scale, we would do like ministry videos. That usually takes a little bit more work because it's not just a talking head of somebody sitting there talking about the ministry. We're usually filming what their ministry is doing. So that's being more in the field on that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Which is so fun to see, like all the different things that God's doing in these different ministries. Like amazing, amazing work. And I'm like, this is in my backyard and I never knew about it. And I've searched for it, like I played roles in churches where we went out and connected with ministries, and I've found ministries since doing this work that I'm like, Lord, I didn't know this was out here. And he's like, yeah, tell people about it, right? Like that's what we're doing. He's sending us. And I'm like, oh, he needs people to know about this because one, they need support, and two, they are making his glory known among believers and non-believers alike, depending on what it is. And it's so powerful what's going on. And a lot of Christians, especially in the American church, simply don't know how to get connected or don't know they even exist.
yeah, in a lot of these ministries that we've noticed, like a lot of these ministries, there is some sensitivity to it. Like we've worked with a bunch of organizations. I want to be clear, ministries. Like we work with ministries that are God focused, Christ focused, in for ultimately meeting a physical need and a spiritual need in the people that they serve. So it's not just like free game for organizations that feed homeless or do something along those lines. It's definitely got to be Christ centered. But we work with a lot of those Christ centered organizations are anti-trafficking, working with orphans, children, prison ministry, addiction, like a lot of these really sensitive things. So there is something special that we bring to the table of being able to tell these sensitive stories in a way that like they can't
Respects privacy.
yeah, respects privacy, respects the child of God that is loved by him. Like we don't want to make anybody look bad in any of these videos. We also don't want to
Exploit someone's like current state,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, you don't want to do the puppy in the puppy mill arms of the angel song to make people feel bad for these people, because that's not what this is about,
No.
right? They need to be dignified, they need to be showed as loved, and of course, ultimately a child of God.
Well, and really, like, that's the overall kind of background of our hearts of empowering people and emboldening people to share their testimonies, right? So, like, if the testimony comes across as something that is anything less than glorifying to God and honoring to that person, we're not going to use it. So, there's even been sometimes where like we're sharing ministry stories or testimony stories, and if it comes across wrong, we just won't use it because that's not what God has called us to do. So we're always in a place of um, elevating, in a sense, to really shine light on what God is doing. And He's not gonna just come and like cast a shadow on you and say, "How dare you?" Or if someone's coming across that way, right? We're not gonna do that either. But I think that's what's really awesome about being that person behind the camera, like you were talking about before, is I get to see these people like start to open up about what they do. And I'm all excited behind the camera. I mean, like, if anyone could see, we should do a video one day of like my face and reaction. I'm pretty much just crying the whole time, or
All the time.
smiling or laughing. But it's like so cool to hear how these people's hearts are moved for the Lord and moved for people. And like just watching, they've poured out their lives for these people to grow and develop and hear from the Lord and meet the Lord, whatever these various ministries are. And then watching that come to fruition and someone tell their testimony of how a ministry has like gone above and beyond for them. Like, yeah, it's honoring to that ministry, but it's also like, look what God did for me. Like, He singled me out and showed me His love. And it, like, I get chills just talking about it. It's just so cool to watch that happen and like watch ministries kind of unite with people, or people unite, in different ways with each other in unexpected ways. And it just lifts everybody up. And it's like, yeah, like, that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, like those two things of doing missionary initiative videos is what we call them, and then ministry spotlight videos. Like those two things are um, are a way for us to give back. All this stuff is free. Like we take donations from our own group private people. We don't charge anybody for any of this work. So like that's just a way for us to give back to the kingdom, to those that are serving the kingdom that may not have the resources to do it themselves. On the other hand, like what our ministry is like really called to, and what is our main focus, is that we record testimonies of encounters with God. We on this journey have seen so many miracles, if you want to call them that. Here in the U.S., we have noticed that in other places they're just called everyday life, right?
I was wondering where you were going to get that.
Yeah. So like that is our purpose, and we do that by, hopefully people watching this channel will see the other videos on this channel. We find people that have encountered God in one way or another, and that could look like a bunch of different things. God is the creator of everything, so he moves in every way that he created, I guess. Ways that we haven't even known about yet, because we haven't found that person that has a really unique encounter in something we haven't heard before. But
I love it because there's stuff all like, think of the most miraculous thing that you ever heard of, like healings that are like scientifically unexplainable, right? And then there's stuff that's just really sweet and tender and intimate, that's like an answered prayer in a moment when you need it, and everything in between, right? Like the way the Lord moves and the character that he shows throughout the Bible, like we're seeing in the testimonies today, which makes sense, right? In that Luke 1:1, where we were reading, compiling a narrative of everything that the Lord is doing, he's just continuing that in this different way through what we're doing, and we're seeing the same things are still happening. And it's so cool to see like that spectrum of things, like you said, a variety of things. And it all is just like, yep, that's Jesus. Yep, that's Jesus. And it's so amazing to see, because what we're seeing in Boise, Idaho, we're seeing in LA, we're seeing in Seattle, we're seeing in Phoenix, we're seeing in Uganda, we're seeing in the Bahamas, we're seeing all over the world with all these different missionaries and testimonies we've gotten. And it's like, we know this as Christians, but then to hear it again, it like revitalizes your soul, and it like gives you this encouragement and this boldness to go like, yeah, let's go. Like we're still in the game. Like we're still moving. God's still moving, right?
Yeah. I think that, so when we originally started, we were talking about just testimonies, and testimonies is we found out testimonies is a very Christianese word, where a lot of people would be like, oh, my testimony of when, I came to Christ. And we're like,
your salvation story.
Salvation story. And I'm like, absolutely. Those are great. But like for somebody like myself, right? I grew up in the church at like 6 years old. A Sunday night 90-year-old teacher, Mary Eason, I remember her name, had her little felt.
Shout out.
Yeah, she had her little felt board, and she gave the little story, and I gave my life to Christ and lived life. So and there's a lot of us that have that story, and there's a lot of...
Mine is Miss Wanda.
Miss Wanda, yeah. And then there's a lot of people that have like that story that you're like, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard. So that is an encounter with God. Me, myself, like I wouldn't necessarily call what happened in that classroom my encounter with God. Like my encounters with God came much later in life. And I'm not going to talk about salvation and stuff like that and what that looks like, but
but we all want to hear your testimony someday. So
yeah.
We'll circle back on that.
We'll circle back to my testimony. But the reason, like the second verse after Luke that God gave us, and we have 4 of them, and they just kind of rolled out as like we needed them, I think, because through this whole experience, there's been doubt. There's like, okay, we're doing this, and then all of a sudden something doesn't go right, or people aren't as excited as we are, and we're like, is this actually needed? And then, some people come in and be like, oh yeah, it's super needed. That's great. And we're like, okay, but are we doing it right? And so like, there's these verses that just come out that kind of build into our 4 pillars of what we do. And this one, the second one, was out of Revelation.
Yeah.
And it's Revelation 13, 10 through 12. I'm going to read the whole thing. We usually use just a snippet of it, but It says, "Then I heard a loud voice shouting across the heavens, 'It has come at last, salvation and power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down to earth.'" This is where we usually start. "The one who accuses them before our God day and night. And they have defeated him by the blood of the Lamb and by their testimonies. And they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who live in heavens rejoice. But terror will come on the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you in great anger, knowing that he has little time." We usually also leave out that last part. But the point being in that verse is that like Satan has lost, right? He was cast down to earth and he is angry. Like he is angry, he knows he doesn't have time left, and he is accusing us before God day and night. He's saying, Stephanie is not, look at her. Look at her. She's a sinner. Look at how bad she is. Like, how can you love her, God? Like these things. And it says that we overcome him by the blood of the Lamb, of course,
Jesus.
and the power of our testimonies. So what are our testimonies?
Yeah.
Our testimonies are the movement of God in our life, right? Showing that he is still powerful. And we'll get to another verse a little bit later that kind of reinforces that. But
oh, it's so good. I love that verse. I forgot that was the second one.
Yeah.
That's funny. I was thinking about the one in Joshua, but
Joshua, the one in Joshua, which we'll get to, was the last one.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
That was, and there's
that.
a story behind that as well.
Such a story. Okay, we'll get there.
I'll
We'll
tell
get
that story
there.
too.
I love that verse in Revelation because it's like we've seen it in action. Like we have seen people sit down to share their testimony and they'll start sharing and forgiveness comes and confession comes and things that they're like they'll literally say on camera, which we're ready to, by the way, we share online in all the public platforms.
Yeah.
And they're like, "Oh, I've never said this out loud before." And the power of confession, which I mean, you read about all through the Bible, is so amazing. And you can see it. Like you just see it happening. You see the Bible playing out in real life. You see Jesus healing in like real time through like speaking out to other believers of things that you're going through. Like call back to James. Like it's an important thing. And these people are doing it in such bold ways. And the Lord just honors that. But yeah, the power of your testimony, like sharing it, speaking it out to people. I've also, we recorded a testimony while we were in Uganda, and I shared just verbally with like what we had heard from someone at work, and many people at work actually, but like, wait a minute, that's real. Like God moves like that. God provides for people. God actually hears your prayers. Like, hold on. Non-believers that like now there's this medium in which I can share this like powerful move of God in someone's life and go, "Oh, isn't this crazy? Look at this. This is what God does on my phone in a way that's like not disruptive to a work day." And they're like, "Whoa, that's real." Right? And so like watching that person's testimony from across the ocean affect a non-believer in Boise, Idaho is like, come on, like it's so cool, and it's a real thing.
Yeah, it's funny because like one of the first negative comments that we got online was from a video about a miraculous healing where a man laid on hands to a Catholic priest who was like paralyzed half of his body. He had been like fasting for 3 days, and the priest had been paralyzed for 3 days. And when he came in, he was like, can I pray for you?" And he explains, it's all online. He explains how he prayed for him. He doesn't even remember what he said, just in the name of Jesus Christ, all this stuff. And the guy like threw up his hands, and he was like ecstatic. He's like, "I can move my body. I'm healed. Like whatever like I want to know more about that." And it was a crazy story. And the comment at the very end was like, "Things that didn't happen for 400," which is like a Jeopardy reference, right? And we were so happy because we realized that, in that video that we edited, the miracle didn't happen until the very end. So that person, with his disbelief, watched the entire thing.
Yeah.
And I believe that, God's word does not return void, right? So that is just a seed.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just one of many seeds, but it is a seed that is now there from somebody who has disbelief and has doubt and is a non-believer. And like that was, I loved that. So it was amazing to me to
It
see
is
that
amazing.
bad comment. I was like, awesome.
And interacting with the content itself is like, I hope he sees future videos too.
Yeah.
Because like
The algorithm's going to be like, oh, he commented on this. And
he must be interested.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's fine. And like we welcome, like the goal of this is for non-believers and believers alike, right? Mm-hmm. Like I talked about earlier, like we're emboldening people and encouraging people to share their faith and share their testimony. That is, of course, a believer that has a testimony that God has, moved in their life. And the non-believer that hears it and goes, wait a minute, God cares about me as an individual. Like he cared about you as an individual. He met you in this way that he didn't have to. And he did. Like I can have that. Like, yes, you can have that. Jesus wants that for you.
We have testimonies of like real people being pulled out of real problems, right? Things that the world is struggling with. Everybody in the world struggles with a lot of these things. And to have that encouragement that there is a Redeemer, a Rapha, a God of healing that you can connect with and find love and peace and all these different, and redemption, all these different things. We talk about those stories that we record, that like there's a common thread through them. And it usually has to do with a relationship with Jesus. Like either that, I was praying and God answered, or I was reading the word and God showed me this. I heard this from God. I asked God this. He answered. Like it's all this like personal relationship between the individual and Jesus. And so part of, I would say, our main like target market that we're trying to reach are people that know of God but don't have that relationship. They don't have a prayer life, they don't have a reading life, and they just don't have a relationship with Christ in a way that allows for them to see these things. When people watch our content, or when they come to one of our events, which we'll talk about in a little bit, a lot of the times they're like, I've never seen anything like that. In my comment earlier of like, oh, that's just everyday life over in this third world country because of the reliance and relationship they have on God. You have to ask the individual who says they've never seen anything like this, are you putting yourself in a place, in a posture to see it? How humble are you being, or are you being
available?
Are you being available? Or are you being uptight about what it might look like to see a miracle? Because if you see a miracle and then you have to talk about it, now you're the crazy one. Right? So like there is this give and take. Like, yes, God does break in miraculous ways for people that aren't asking for it. I always go back to Sodom and Gomorrah, when Lot was lingering, and it was like out of compassion, God took him out of there, right? That wasn't him being obedient, being like, I'm going to leave, but God was like, I'm compassionate enough to break in and change what you're trying to make your reality, which is great. And I think that happens all the time. But on like on a daily basis, having that relationship with God, you'll see miracles over and over and over again. And we're trying to encourage people to break into that relationship and share those things that they see, and also getting the word coincidence out of their vocabulary. Like it steals God's glory to be like, that was a coincidence, or maybe it was because of this natural thing that occurs. So
yeah, I think the more you're in relationship with God and you know him, the more you're going to see his character. Just like any earthly relationship, right? The closer you are with someone, the more you learn their character. So whether that's reading the Bible every day or praying every day or whatever that looks like for you to meet with the Lord, hopefully a healthy mixture of both, you will see these things break out, because he can't help but move in compassion. He can't help but move in mercy and grace, and he can't help but move for the people that he loves. So you will see him act in all the same ways he acts throughout the Bible. Like he still is doing the same things and he's the same God and he's still moving in the same ways. So it's really cool to watch the people who have really surrendered and just said, like, God, lead me. They see these things more regularly than people who are partnering with God, say only at the height of a really emotional time or a time of physical need, right? And there are testimonies where God will meet you at the end of yourself. And there's some people who are living at the end of themselves. And so they see it regularly.
Yeah.
And there's some people who have only been at the end of themselves in these really hard moments in life. And then they're like, okay, I'm back on my feet. And they forget or they wander or they just get distracted, whatever the reason is. And so then they stop seeing it because they stop looking, right? And participating. What we started as is like filming the testimonies, right? And they go online and they kind of get distributed. Is great. And it's actually effective and it's growing in all of this, right? And definitely what God has called us to. But we also felt like when God didn't call us overseas, we said, okay, well, where then? And he said Boise, Idaho, which happens to be where we've been living.
Yeah.
And so we were like, are you sure, God? Are you sure here?
Yeah.
Because it's exotic and exciting to go somewhere else, right? But like really, we gave God our yes. He has our yes. You want us to be in Boise? Hallelujah, we're in Boise. So with that, putting stuff online, we also had this burden of like, okay, what are we doing for the people? The people here where we're at, or the people even where we go film testimonies, say we go to, whatever, a different city because we have an opportunity there. What can we do for the people in the moment while we're gathering testimonies? And that's kind of where the power of testimony events were birthed, right? We talked about that book or the verse from Revelations about the power of our testimony. And so sharing the testimony, we notice as people are speaking their testimony out loud, there's healing. So not just sharing online, but taking these testimonies that we filmed and sharing them with a group of people, whether it's a small group, a large group, a congregation, whatever it looks like. We get to really show them a testimony, have them reflect on that testimony and say, how has God moved in this way in my life? How has God provided for me? How has God answered a prayer? Or maybe that time that he didn't answer a prayer, like, how did I walk out in faith anyways? How have I obeyed and stepped out in a way that he's called me to recently? Whatever that looks like. And so they start thinking about it. And then they share with these people that they've been living life with, if it's a church group or small group or family or whatever it is. And they start sharing things they've never shared before. And it's like breakthrough.
Yeah. And the coolest thing about that, so like the format is we have a couple videos that we've already produced. We show one and then we have some questions that we ask people to get them engaged in their own testimonies. And we do that. We have like 3 of them, but we get through as many as we can get through, depending on how engaged the people are. Usually there are some people in the group that are more engaged than others, and then they kind of help each other along. But like some of the breakthrough that we've seen in that stuff is amazing, because like we are encouraging people to share their own testimonies and stuff like that. But we're also encouraging people to realize the testimonies they've forgotten.
Yeah.
Right. We've had ones where somebody will say like, "Oh, I don't know if I have a testimony because I grew up in a great family. We always went to church. There wasn't much fighting. Like, I don't really have much to complain about." And the person next to her like started crying, and she's like, "I didn't even know that was possible." Like, that person's testimony is that there is hope, that there is a I don't want to say conflictless life.
No.
But definitely a life that is more focused on Christ, that builds families together in a helpful, hopeful way.
Yeah.
But like we do throw some softball questions out there. I think the one that we joke about the most is like, have you ever been on a mission trip, and where was it? What does that look like? Right? And everybody gets excited if they've been on one, to be like, oh, I went and helped build houses, or did this over here and stuff like that. But in the same way, we have one of my favorite ones to show is a story about a man who was telling the first time he heard God tell him to go pray for healing over somebody. And this was later on in his life. He was, in his probably 30s at this time. And he said he was at church and they were giving this announcement about a little girl who was sick. And they were going to announce that she was getting better and, all that kind of stuff. And like an hour before service, I guess the word came by that the girl was she wasn't going to make it. Things had made a turn for the worse. And so he felt like God told him in that moment, like, you need to go pray for this little girl. So he goes on to talk about how like that hospital was like an hour or so away. And he went and he immediately left and he went and drove to that hospital. And there's a little cute story about how they met in the elevator on the way up and on accident and stuff like that. And he ended up praying over her for healing. And then he says ultimately a week later he got a call that said that she was healed by being called to heaven. Like God took her home. And for anybody stepping out on faith in something that uncomfortable and that something that big, like that's gut wrenching.
Yeah. Feels like an unanswered prayer.
Yeah. And so he goes on to tell the second part of the story where he just felt like he needed to be obedient to when God told him to pray for somebody, that he would. Like that was a covenant that he made in that moment of like, I'm going to do this. And then he tells...
That's faithfulness.
Yeah. And then he tells another story about the first time he saw somebody miraculously healed. That one's online. People can watch it. The whole story will be there eventually. But the point is that there was a 6-year gap between that first time of praying for somebody and the first time seeing somebody actually healed. And then we have to ask the uncomfortable question to the room: what does it look like for you to have unanswered prayers?
Yeah.
How do you wrestle with God? Are you willing to limp the rest of your life? To wrestle with God on an unanswered prayer?
I think what's so cool about testimonies like that is that when people share about their struggles and their wrestling with God, they really like open up about their own ways that they have been struggling or wrestling with God, because it's not easy, but a lot of Christians don't want to admit that they're wrestling, right? Like we don't necessarily, it's not like a proud moment, even though all throughout the Bible people wrestle with God all the time, or they choose for whatever reason to like not align in obedience with what God's calling, or they're unfaithful in a certain moment or certain tragedy in their life, right? But we don't like to talk about it. It's not a proud moment. We're like filled with a little bit of shame or guilt about that sometimes. But when we see other people struggled and they came through on the other side, like it gives you courage to say, oh, I did that too, and I don't want to do that, and I want to grow from this, right? So like I think that's what's really cool about our Power of Testimony nights is people start sharing things that they've never shared before, and people start opening up about things that they've only had in their prayer life, or maybe their spouse knows but no one else knows, sort of a thing. So
yeah, that's a common like phrase that people say. We'll have them in front of the camera and they'll be like, I've never told anybody this before, or I didn't plan to talk about this.
yeah, and I really think that's the Spirit moving in those moments too, of like bringing to mind things that they didn't even necessarily plan to share, right? And I think that's God saying, hey, let's bring this out of the darkness into light and lay it all out on the table. And through that confession and repentance, there's this freedom that he gives, right? Which, I mean, it's all throughout the Bible. This is what he says to do. But to see it happening in real life, it's like, whoa, Jesus is moving. Even in the moments of filming, as they're recollecting on a time that Jesus moved in the past. So it's really cool to see it play out in real time.
Yeah. And let me ask you, like, did you ever picture yourself as a therapist?
Definitely not.
So like what does that look like? Unpack that for me, like as somebody that just wakes up in the morning and reads their Bible and prays and thinks about God often, like your life then compared to now sitting behind a camera, just listening to people's hearts as they sometimes break down, and it turns into a ministering session instead of a recording session.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot like, therapists don't tell you what to do. And I definitely don't have any sort of therapy degree. And, I wouldn't say I do therapy, but I pray with people, right? Like, so I hear their hurting heart and I pray with them and say, let's like invite God into this moment and let's invite God in to heal these things. And he's the one who does all the change, right? The real change in your life comes from Jesus. So when you like start surrendering that to God, that's where the freedom happens. But yeah, sitting on the other side of the camera, I'm crying like almost all of the time. If I'm not crying, I'm laughing or I'm just like so engaged in what these people are saying because when they talk about how God moves, their eyes light up and their soul lights up and they get all passionate about it and they're going back to hard times that turned into beauty, right?
Yeah.
These times of ashes that were turned into beauty, and it's like so amazing to watch. And I mean, I'm kind of a crier anyways, but like seeing how he's redeemed people over and over and over again, like it never gets old. Like I just absolutely love it. And I never would have thought that interviewing would bring so much like peace and encouragement to me. But I'm ministered to on the other end of that. So while I'm ministering to people, they're ministering to me, and it's just this really beautiful picture of this like unity that God has in a community of believers, even in the formal setting of like filming.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that when you're spending time with people talking about God and how good he is and what he's doing, that it then ends up morphing or turning into a time where you get to actually just talk to God, right? So we do these testimonies, people talk about their experience with God, and then yeah, at the end of it, we usually end up in some sort of a prayer session. If somebody one time somebody was like, I've never heard God's voice and stuff, and I was like, well, let's pray for that.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's not anything crazy. It's just you have a desire to hear God's voice and you're not hearing it. Let's ask him together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really cool to see a group of believers come around someone that say is maybe walking a different denomination than them. Maybe that yeah, they've never heard God's voice, or they hear when they read their Bible, but they don't necessarily feel like they hear anything when they're praying or whatever that may look like. And to watch a group of believers come around and say, I believe for you.
Mm-hmm.
That Jesus wants, to commune with you in a deeper way, and you want to commune with him in a deeper way, and so it's going to happen because his will is to be in relationship with you. So it's really cool to watch other people unite around somebody and lift them up, which I mean, like, this is why we tell these stories, right? Mm-hmm. We want to share these stories of what God is doing, what we've seen and what we've heard, so that people can feel encouraged. Yeah. So I mean, and we're seeing it happen right in front of our eyes so naturally.
You see the Bible come alive in some of those instances where you're talking about like people coming together and praying for these things for somebody for them, and it just reminds me of the story when the man was lowered down from the building, and Jesus was like, because of the faith of your friends, is basically what he was saying, is like you will be healed.
Yeah.
Like he didn't say because of your faith, he said because of your friend's faith, like you will be healed.
Such an interesting passage.
Yeah, it definitely it puts a new perspective and spin on intercessing and praying and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But with that said, we have a third verse that we kind of use as one of our pillars for our ministry, and this was one that came to you, not me.
Yeah. So I was reading the Bible, and there's actually like a second verse part of this revelation, but I was studying a passage and I was trying to figure out God, like what does this mean? And he sent me, as I was thinking about our ministry, he sent me over to Matthew where John the Baptist is imprisoned. And do you want to read it directly out of the Bible?
I'll read
it. But yeah, it's in Matthew where John's basically feeling discouraged, and Jesus gives him just a really powerful word.
Yeah, so it's in Matthew 11, verse 2 through 6. It says, John the Baptist, who was in prison, heard about all the things the Messiah was doing. So he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else? Jesus told them, Go back to John and tell him what you have heard and seen. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are risen and are risen to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor. I know there's another version of this in one of the other gospels that talks about when they show up. It says that Jesus had just finished preaching the gospel, healing all the sick, and casting out all the demons, and he told them to go tell John what they saw and heard, which is why we call this the Go Tell John podcast, if people were curious, because we just want to go tell John or tell the body of Christ, tell the world what we've seen and heard God doing.
Yeah, for the purpose of their encouragement, especially. Like, if John, who Jesus says is the greatest man to ever have lived, if John is discouraged, and obviously, he's going through a hard time, he's about to be beheaded, right? So, like,
Spoiler.
rough spot, spoiler alert, rough place to be in, obviously. But if he can get discouraged as this greatest man who ever lived, other than Jesus himself, then, like, obviously so can we. And what we've seen while we've been ministering, you and I, in the church, since we started, which is a short career, but what we've seen is a very consistent discouragement among congregations or the body of Christ in do miracles still happen? Is God still moving the same way he was in the New Testament, or Old Testament for that matter? Is he really as close, to us and maybe to other people, but not to me? Or miracles happen in third world countries, but they don't happen here. Demons, may occur in third world countries, but not here, sort of a thing. And what we want to show is the same character of God and the same moves of God are happening that happened in the Bible, that happened in the early church, that are still happening today, whether you're in Uganda, whether you're in Seattle, whether you're in Boise, Idaho. It's all happening everywhere. And when believers start talking about it, it points back to Jesus. It points back every time. And it just shows, like, hey, he still very much cares. He's still very near.
Yeah, I think that that passage about like God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Like, of course, his character is the same, but if you look at what his character did in the Old Testament, it was to show himself out of the love he had for his people. So why, if he was that father then, why would he not still be that father now of doing things for his children to show his love to us? And of course, you can get really deep into the weeds of what love actually is when it comes to correction versus, blessings and all that kind of stuff. But in general, you can look at those things back then and they are still happening now. And when you talk about, you said whether God is close. Like, if you are a believer, if you've submitted your life to Christ, there's no closer you can actually be. Like, Jesus was the man on earth that we don't get to see in person, and he is gone until he comes back again. Like, God is this father that we can't see face to face because of our sin and stuff like that. But the Spirit is something that lives inside of us, and it's closer than anything else that we can have in our lives.
Yeah, and so I think that's what's so tragic about some of these things that we've heard from congregants is that, depending on your denominational line and all that, you believe a variety of different things. But something that everybody holds pretty dear is that we are born again and the Spirit resides within us once we are saved, right? So, and whatever that looks like, sure. But, like, we all have this belief that the Spirit is in us. We are a living temple for the Lord. And for a believer to be out there and feel that God's not near, God's not listening, or Jesus isn't close, like, it just breaks my heart because it it's not true. And why, the question then is, like, why aren't you experiencing the Lord? And I think what we've found through gathering these testimonies and personal experience is it often has to do with the amount of dedication that you've given back, the amount of surrender that you have in your life to seek him, the amount of time that you put in, not just time, but like heart posture, um, more than time, of like, I'm giving up something and I'm sacrificing so that I can spend time with you, so I can know you. And I think that's kind of where we miss the mark sometimes, is we kind of go through the steps in Western culture. We're very like ABC, bullet point, check off my list, like busy, busy, busy. And we don't slow down enough to realize that like God's trying to talk to us all day long. And he, if you give him a yes and you give him your time, like he's right there so fast and he's talking to you, and we just haven't given him the emotional or mental or spiritual space to like talk to us and us to listen, right?
Yeah, and I think there is a for me in general, like reading through the Psalms and seeing what it really looks like to feel the depravity of God. You know, the way that David talks about God of being abandoned and how long must I wait? How long will you leave me here? Kind of things. And I don't know if we have that. I don't know if we sit there and lament to God about like, I know I'm going through this, and how long do I have to wait for this lesson to pass, this crucible to burn a fire, and smelt me down to something else.
We do live in that culture of instant gratification too. So, like, if we don't get an answer from the Lord right away in prayer, well, either He doesn't want me to have it, or, it's not going to get answered, or maybe He doesn't care about the little things, right? Like, these are the things we hear from people. And I think instead of that, maybe it's that it's not on our timeline, right? And you still just give it more space. Like, give him time to respond how he responds, and don't necessarily give up on that thing that is your heart's desire when seeking the Lord. So if you desire to meet with him, you desire to hear from him, don't stop knocking at the door, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what's key, from what we've seen in these testimonies, is people saying, I was praying, I was reading the word, I heard from the Lord, or when I was talking to God and all these revelations start happening, or these miracles start happening, or this breakthrough starts to happen, and it's all centered around people seeking that personal relationship and expectation of response. I mean, actually, I'm going to take that last part back. Some of them weren't expecting response. Sometimes he intervenes just because he is moved by our deep desire and longing for a family member to come to Christ, for example, or in someone else's pain and healing journey. Like he just pours that out. So sometimes there's expectation and sometimes there's not, like you said about, healed by someone else's faith. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's your faith. Sometimes it's because God wants to move for whatever reason. There's a purpose in it, right? So like, yeah, it's the great mystery of the Lord. But I do think it's all through us seeking him out and him going, oh, I've been here the whole time waiting. I'm so happy you're here.
And I think there's something we've experienced this before. And again, story for another day. But we've experienced things where we have had a conversation with each other in like our Bible reading and prayer time in the morning, or even myself. I've said something that was like, or thought something that was like, oh, I really don't want this to happen, and God delivers on it. And when He does, like it makes you have to sit back and think and be like, God, was I too embarrassed to ask God? Like, was this too small of a thing for me to ask God for? But it was clearly like a desire of my heart, in some way, even a small way, and to see that like taken care of or like fulfilled by God, that order fulfilled, by God, even when I was not directly asking Him. It really makes you sit back and think like, oh man, he's not only like listening to my prayers, my fervent prayers, but he's also just listening to the conversations that I'm having here and there. It's really really cool.
He is this abundant God that likes to pour out blessings among his people, specifically the righteous. And what makes us righteous? It's the blood of Christ and accepting it, right? So, like, which is wild to think about. Like, that's that's what Jesus did for us, right? And God just wants to pour out on us, because when he looks at us, he sees purity because of the blood of Christ. And when you are asking for these things, like, and just to like clarify a little bit, the things that you were desiring and asking for were in the end, they were going to bring more fruit to the kingdom, right? They were going to bring glory to God. It was like stuff that's not necessarily um, needed, but would make, say, filming these testimonies way more practical, especially given that we have a young, a toddler, right? So like, no, Lord, this isn't necessary. And you didn't even ask. I remember you even
I'll
saying
do
this.
it either way.
We don't need this. Yeah, I'll do it either way. We don't technically need it, but man, that would make it so much easier. And he hears you, and his heart is bent towards you, and he delivers. Which is just a beautiful thing. That's the God that we serve, that he cares about the little things, right? Like he's not like, well, you're going to suffer for me no matter what. Although there is a sense of suffering, right?
Yeah.
It's not always like that. He's abundant and he wants to bless us. And I think that's a huge thing that people also don't experience. So when people tell those types of testimonies, they realize like, oh, I don't have to live in this poverty mindset, right? And then when people share testimonies of suffering, or say chronic pain, or living in an area that is less than ideal, all for the sake of the kingdom, like you were blessed abundantly in many ways, but in the physical sense, like, yeah, no, right?
Yeah.
But people hear those testimonies and they go, oh, I have so much excess. How can I be generous with it? How can I give it back to the Lord? Not that he's necessarily going to take it away, but like, how can I use what I have to serve God?
Yeah. Okay. So earlier you talked about how the Spirit that lives in all of us, the Holy Spirit, to be exact, um, and yet also like multiple denominations. Like we do these testimony nights. We've had people from all over different churches, different denominations, and sometimes even different religions come to these events. So with all of us who are followers of Christ that have the Spirit in us, what does unity across denominations and churches look like?
Yeah. Well, just to like start off, unity is something that is so like close to Jesus's heart. Like the unity of the Trinity is what he wants then with us, right? He wants us to be one as he and the Father are one, which is like a huge thing. And if you look at the Christian church, and I mean all of God's people, we're so disjointed, right? Even though we do have this common thread of unity. So, when we got the word um in our ministry that we should be focusing on unity, I was really like, I don't know what this looks like, God. Like, I don't know how to do this because we've been disjointed for hundreds of years. Like, who am I to come in and say we need unity? In fact, I've talked to pastors about it in the past, and I've gotten eye rolls and fat chance and good luck. And these are pastors who also want this. Yeah. They do want it, but they've run up against a wall over and over and over again. So there's discouragement even there when it comes to unity. But I think the thing to kind of come back to the Holy Spirit living in us is that is our unity. The unity that we have is that we all believe that the Holy Spirit is living within us. We all believe that at salvation, we are brought into this union with Christ, to whatever that looks like in the spiritual sense. We all have this understanding that Jesus united us and redeemed us and brought us back into relationship with the Father, right? So when we talk about talking with the Lord or hearing from God, whether it's reading or whatever particular way someone experiences this, many Christians can sit down and watch that and feel that, understanding that I could have that too. Jesus wants this relationship for me. Jesus wants these same things for me. All of this aligns with the character of God in the Bible, and there's no reason to believe that if that Christian experienced it yesterday, that I couldn't experience it today. And so I think unity is in that sense. Like, we don't have to agree on every topic. We don't have to even necessarily talk about every topic. What Jesus wants is our eyes on him and our hearts bent towards him. And so if we can draw people to him and focus on him and what he is doing, then all the other stuff fades away. And how you live that out can still be its own thing. But what he wants is us to say, hey, look at Jesus. Look what he did for me. And look what he wants to do for you. And that's very unifying.
Yeah, I mean, a phrase that just kind of comes to mind when you talk about this, which I don't usually do this kind of stuff, but is like a holy jealousy. You know, like our ministry of sharing God's personal, like very personal relationship with people, to the point where they're sharing this as well. Like that, some of the things that we film, and not everything makes it to the internet. Some stuff stays on the cutting room floor because it's too intimate, or whatever the reason is, as we're discerning on how to do that. Like people are willing to share super, super intimate moments of their life with the world. And I think that can be, with an open heart, can be contagious, of like a holy jealousy. Jealousy is not necessarily a bad thing. God is jealous, and God is all good, right? So in the
For
right
our
direction,
affection and our attention, right?
yeah. So when pointed in the right direction, like jealousy can be something that is really fruitful, for us.
Yeah, I think if it leads you to like, I want that relationship with Jesus, like not in a covetous way, but in a way that's like, I see the joy that has come to your life and I crave that. And I think God made us to, I know this, God made us to be in relationship with him. So the emptiness in our hearts that we feel when we don't have him is because we are lacking something that we were made to have.
Yeah.
So when you see it, it makes sense that in our fallen condition or whatever, if it's a holy jealousy, like you're suggesting, like, I want that. Not only do I want that, but I need that. Like, I need Jesus and I need to know him and I need him to know me and I want him to move in my life and all this stuff. Like, it makes sense that we would feel that way. And I think you're right. It is healthy to go, pick me. Like, I want this. I want this. And Jesus goes, oh, thank you. I've been waiting. I want you to.
Yeah, I think there's something to be seeing the relationship somebody else has and going, not understanding what it feels like, and to look at them and go like, I want that.
Yeah.
Right. And then from that, like it's a weird movement, but like hopefully that's what we're kind of shooting for a lot of these testimonies is a holy jealousy, for a connection and a relationship with God.
Yeah. And that's why it's go and, tell John what you saw and heard here. It's all pointing to, that verse is pointing to Jesus being the Messiah. Like, it's not pointing to, and look at the provision God gave me, and look at my breakthrough and how good my life is now, right? Like, we're not looking towards ourselves. We're having people say, hey, look over here because you can see Jesus if you look close.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so we have one more pillar.
Yeah, and really, like, I think, I mean, you've got a great story going into it. I didn't even know that we needed more direction necessarily on what we were doing. But as the Lord's like laid out these verses, it's gotten more and more clear, kind of like a funnel. Like, he gave us a broad thing to start with, and we're like, yes, Lord. And then he gives us a narrow thing. We're like, oh, that's even better. Like, we understand it. And then one more piece narrower, and we're like, yeah, this is great. We feel like so spot on. And then he just took it home with his last one.
Yeah. So later on in our ministry walk, right, there was some doubt in what we were doing. I was like, I just don't like, there was some traction there, but I was like, I just don't know if this is it. It feels
like the full picture, or
yeah. Like okay, we're doing these testimonies, and I would say some of it is where we live now. It was hard to get traction. We're seeing traction a lot, better in other places, which is interesting. That's a whole nother topic altogether. But I remember I went to a conference, and in the morning I had somebody prophesy over me, and this wasn't even part of the conference. I went to go, like, on a lunch break, go see a friend, right? And he's like, oh, I've got this guy here. And I was like, okay. New stuff for me, right? So I was like,
What
all
kind of
right.
guy? What do you mean?
And like a prophet guy,
Okay.
like a guy that prophesies over people.
Sure.
Like
But
that's,
see, I grew up Pentecostal, so I'm like, all right, cool. Traveling prophet is normal.
Yeah, but
but for you,
that's
not
his
so
gig,
much.
right? That's his gig. He's like, I
Okay.
prophesy over people. And I was like, okay. And the conference was already a pretty charismatic conference. More like it was thrown by our church, but it was more charismatic than what our church normally operates on a Sunday afternoon. So anyways, I go and see this friend, and he's like, he's here, he's in town, he's back from Jerusalem. Like, you need to have him prophesy over you. I was like, all right, I got a couple minutes, I guess, before I gotta get back to this conference.
Love it.
And this was like at 11 in the morning. And
are you skeptical at this point?
I'm not skeptical. I'm willing to
You've been
foster.
humbled.
I'm willing to foster these things and then weigh them usually after the fact.
Okay. Yeah. They're like you said, discernment is something that is a strength. Yeah.
It's not harmful, so I was like, oh, I'll listen.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, excited. I'm like, cool, do it. And he's saying all the stuff. And there's a point where he talks about, he's like, I see you in a bulldozer. And I'm like, okay, it's already starting off weird.
I'm a graphic designer and videographer.
And he's like,
okay.
And he's like, and you're building a road for people to walk on. And I was like, cool, metaphorical stuff. And he's like, you're building something. And I was like, all right. He went on some other stuff, and I was like, cool. And I was like, yeah, he doesn't know me from anybody. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, cool, I'm building something. I'm doing ministry work. Like, we're building something here. Yeah. Sure. I was like, that's a pretty cool little nod to what we're doing. And so I go back to the conference.
But like, what's the point?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I go back to the conference, and I was like, that was cool. That was nice. I'll put that in my pocket and put it in my little dream journal that I got from these different things. And cool. I was at the conference, and it was getting late. It was the end of the night when all the crazy cool stuff happens, all that kind of stuff. Which again, like for me, coming from my background, I'm like, this is weird stuff, but I will.
When you say weird, give me a little detail. Yeah, more Holy Spirit or what?
Yeah, if anybody's seen anything like Slain in the Spirit, Gift of Laughter, falling over, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so lots of prayer happening.
Things that you would have seen every day of the week growing up in a Pentecostal church, and something that I had never seen before.
Got it. Okay.
So, but again, open, right? So I'm watching all this happen and things like that, and the guest speaker that was there that night, very, very strong man of the Lord, does great work overseas, and all that kind of stuff, and very big on missionaries. I think he does something that equips missionaries. So he's like, I am not going to leave this room tonight until I pray for everybody that wants to be prayed for. And I was like, okay. So of course everybody's lining up around the walls. Yeah. And I'm standing over there. I was like, I'll get in line. I'll wait. And this was like 11 o'clock at night, almost exactly like 12 hours after the prophecy from that morning. And he ends up getting over to me. His like intercessory prayer team like totally passed me up. I was like, this is okay. And he comes up and he lays his hand on my chest, and he says, you're building something. And I,
call back.
Yeah. And they talk about like when you fall over and things like that, like, oh, you feel electricity or cold or like this stuff. Again, all new stuff to me. And that was not it at all. But when that happened, it was like there was a magnet in my chest, and I just crumpled down. Wow. I ended up on the floor and just kind of like thanking God for like being so sweet that like, that again, like I'm taking those two things, I'm putting them on my pocket, I'm keeping them for later and stuff like that. But the idea that like, I was very discouraged right before I went up for prayer because of some other things that happened. And then that two people that didn't know each other and didn't know me from totally different areas, like said the same thing over me in a unique way. Was like,
what does this mean?
Yeah, it was very special.
Yeah.
So then I was sitting there, we were talking. I was like, well, what am I building? Like, I know that I'm building.
When you say we were talking.
Yeah, you and me.
Oh, we were talking.
Yeah, we were
I thought you
talking.
meant you were praying.
No,
okay.
no.
I act as if I wasn't there.
Yeah, you were definitely there.
I remember what I wasn't at the conference.
Yeah, you weren't.
So when you came home, you're fleshing this out. And
yeah, you were.
I'm just excited because this is Chris's first Pentecostal conference. So I'm like,
you stayed home with our son so that I could go.
Experience?
Yeah.
How did it feel?
So we were talking, and I was like, cool. Like, I know I'm building, like, we're building something here, like a ministry that's cool. But like, two of the other things that were said was like, you're building a road for people to walk on, and like the other one, he was talking about that it's like a pipe of water in the desert for people to drink from. To quench their thirst. And so I was like, okay, well, what on that level, like, what am I building here? What are we building here? It was that Sunday, we had somebody get on stage, and he was preaching. He was talking about what does an altar look like today? Like, he was talking about the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
Abram and the story that we're going to talk about in Joshua, where people would build altars to God. They just stack up stones.
Traveling through the desert, build an altar. Something happens, build an altar. Yeah.
And then, like, God
as like a thank
reveals
you,
himself in some of those situations.
Sure. Right?
Yeah. So he brought up the story in Joshua where he was talking about how they just got done in the desert and they crossed the Jordan on dry land, right? It's the mirror of leaving Egypt and God's promise of, I'm getting you to the promised land, right? So once they all crossed, he took 12 stones and he built them all up. And I'll just read it real quick to say exactly what he said. It said, the people crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. Then they camped at Gilgal, just east of Jericho. It was there at Gilgal that Joshua piled up the 12 stones taken from the Jordan River. Then Joshua said to the Israelites, in the future, your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them, this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the river right before your eyes, and he kept it dry until you were all across, just as he did at the Red Sea, when he dried it up until he had all crossed over. He did this so all the nations of the earth might know that the Lord's hand is powerful, and so you might fear the Lord your God forever. Ooh. And it just kind of hit.
Praise Jesus.
That what we are doing, what we are building as a ministry, is building an altar to God. We're building an altar. Each stone is a testimony so that current and future generations can come and see. And when they look at it, they'll go, God's hand is great. Yeah. Right? There is fear of the Lord in these people. So, yeah, it kind of that fourth pillar of our ministry is just building an altar to God. And it's a digital altar, online, but still an altar to God, to his glory.
Yeah, and I think, anytime God did something, you look at Abram, you look at Isaac, you look at Jacob, they would set up an altar when they had an encounter with God, right? Something would happen, and they would set up an altar in remembrance of him so that when people saw it, they would say, oh, Yahweh did something, right? And so that's what this is in the digital world, which is so cool because it's like, we don't use that word, which is why it's like, you didn't just like see the Bible verse and go, oh, that's what we're doing. Like, it really like was this revelation from God of like, oh, I'm building an altar. Oh, that's so cool. Like, of course I'll build you an altar. Who would say no to that? Like, if Yahweh comes to you and says, build me an altar, well, praise Jesus, we're building him an altar. So I love that he said through unity, right? Like through unity and through his people and a variety of people and all the things he's done, we're building this altar. for current and future generations, is what that verse says, like you mentioned. So like this online platform, however long the online world exists into the future, is going to exist. And people will see this and they can't help but see Yahweh. They can't help but see Jesus or in the Spirit moving. And you have to confront it. Is this real? Is it not? Does he want to speak to me? Does he not? Like, who am I as in a piece of this puzzle? And you can't, when you see an altar, just like when you see a road sign, you can't unsee it. You've seen it. Then you have to decide, like, what was that?
Yeah, and I think one of the really cool, like, poetic things about this altar, reading it, he built it with the 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel. And, like, would you now explain those people as unified?
Absolutely not.
Like, that's the thing, is like, the tribes all had their different purposes and probably their different beliefs in different things like that, and jobs and everything was segregated in that way. But when they all went to the promised land together, there was an altar of a stone of each one of them that was the unifying altar to God about what had happened.
Yeah. I love the poetry throughout the Bible. It's so beautiful. And then, like, even watching it play out in our lives, how God's like showed us stuff, right? It's very poetic. He's a very creative God, and that's still very true. So yeah, it's never just this, at least it hasn't been for me, I should say. It's never been just this straightforward black and white thing. It's a very poetic experience, walking with the Lord.
Yeah. I mean, that's the last pillar that we have for our ministry. Obviously, we are going to do some more podcasts that deep dive into who I am and the miracles that have happened in my life, and who you are and the miracles that have happened in your life. If you're watching this podcast, we invite you to subscribe and like this one so you'll see ones in the future. Our whole goal for this podcast is to bring people who have sold out for Christ, who have lived their life for Him, and because of that have encountered Him in miraculous ways. So we're looking to have, pastors and missionaries and just, just people like us who have spent time with God and see how beautiful it is to watch Him work in your life. You can also follow us on Instagram if you're over there for some more shorter form content. And if you want to see any of the testimonies we're talking about or are going to be talking about in the future, we're putting them right here on this channel. So when you subscribe here, keep on coming back and watch some of those videos to be encouraged, because that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you guys for watching.
So exciting.